been a great honor for me to sit next to Jan Ships, who, for us Mormon files, as I call myself, helped pave the way for non-Mormons to pursue scholarly pursuits, to push the handcart, so to speak, for us, to use a Mormon expression. Pull the handcart. That shows my insider outside. Pull, push. So let me dive right into my talk. Next October, Barack Obama will square off against the Republican nominee in 3 presidential debates on college campuses in Colorado, New York, and in Florida. After a series of Romney alternatives have sparked and faded and sparked again, the odds of the former governor of Massachusetts winning the nomination are still in his favor. I actually checked InTrade this morning, which is the site that has become very popular where you can buy and sell stock on the presidential election. And Romney was down to, after South Carolina, 62. He's back up to 88%, which for Mormon studies people like me who hope to get a job one day in Mormon studies is great news. But according to most recent indicators, Romney's much debated Mormon problem, perhaps his main impediment to the Republican nomination in 2008, is less of a problem among the white evangelicals on whom he'll depend in both the remaining primaries and general election. If Romney does get the nomination, one element of the Mormon problem will come into stark relief under the floodlights in the college auditoriums hosting the presidential debates. For more than 140 years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints forbid blacks from full church membership. For most of this time, church officials justified this exclusion by asserting that blacks were the permanently cursed descendants of the biblical anti-heroes, Cain and Canaan. Black men could not have the Mormon priesthood, and black couples could not marry in Mormon temples. Now, in the media, the image of a devout Mormon trying to unseat America's first black president has already led to questions about Romney's responsibility to address his church's so-called black problem. On the Huffington Post, biblical scholar Aubrey M. Hendricks, a New Yorker, insists that he does not believe in religious litmus tests of any kind. Quote, "Yet, I must admit that there is something about Mitt Romney's religion that I find deeply troubling," unquote. Most troubling for Hendricks is the keystone for the Latter-day Saints movement, the Book of Mormon itself. Yet for Mormons, the often-spoken phrase, "I believe that the Book of Mormon is true," is partly of the litany of claims that forms the unofficial LDS confession of faith, the Mormon equivalent to the Islamic Shahada, perhaps. Beginning his article with a dismissal of religious litmus tests, Hendricks, an African-American, ends with an open letter directed to Governor Romney, demanding that he, quote, "disavow the portions of your holy book that so sorely denigrate the humanity of me, my loved ones, and all people of black African descent," unquote. According to Hendricks, for Romney to be president of the United States, he must, in essence, apostatize. On the New York Times' Campaign Stops blog, Lee Siegel proposes what is, at first glance, a counterintuitive argument. 4 years after the nation celebrated the election of America's first black president, Siegel posits that Romney's whiteness is the one quality that has suddenly fueled his candidacy and could put him over the top in the fall. This whiteness is not about actual phenotype. It telegraphs, it signifies a cultural alternative to America's first black president. Siegel locates the incubator of this whiteness in the LDS Church, which he calls the strongest bastion of pre-civil rights American whiteness. In Siegel's view, white evangelicals can call Mormonism a cult. They can also thank God that the LDS Church denied full black membership until 1978, safeguarding white American culture so that it, again, Mormon parlance, can be restored in November 2012 in the latter days of white American exceptionalism. I contributed to the vetting of the Mormon and race problem. In the New Republic, I situated the history of Mormon racial exclusion as a conflict between 2 major impulses of Mormon identity: a particularistic gospel that favors certain ethnic groups, and a universalizing call to teach the gospel to everyone, everywhere. I hope to show that the modern church has emphasized Mormon universalism over racial particularity. Still, today's church leaders have not repudiated the troubling statements of their past predecessors. This silence from the top means that Black Mormons continue to be the targets of racial slurs in their ward meeting houses and even in Mormon temples. Media criticism is not the central discipline of my talk, however. Instead, I wish to narrate a history, or more precisely histories, specifically multivalent histories about the Black Mormon past. The history of the LDS Church's practice of racial exclusion is what I'd call an oft-told tale. Yet there are at least two histories of the LDS Church and its relationship with African Americans, even two pre-1978 histories. One of these histories is of racial exclusion. The other history is one of Mormon empathy, even kinship with African Americans, created out of a shared past of persecution by white or Gentile America, including the failure of the American constitutional system to protect basic civil liberties. The second history is not a rebuttal of the first. Instead, it is a parallel history that emerges from a different set of assumptions about Mormons and their church. So this one oft-told tale becomes here twice told. The goal of my talk is to narrate both of these histories by focusing on four aspects of the history of Black Mormon relations. I will follow a telling of an aspect of the history of Mormon racial exclusion with a telling of the same or similar aspect from a perspective of Mormon racial inclusion, or at least empathy with African Americans. So first aspect, the Book of Mormon, a white supremacy text or a universal gospel. Hendricks is correct that any discussion of Mormonism and African Americans must begin with the Book of Mormon itself. Yet his exegesis flattens the text to one single note of white supremacy, when it is in fact complicated, multi-voiced, and prophetic. The Nephites, whose historians and prophets kept the records that would become the Book of Mormon, portrayed the Lamanites as wicked and unrighteous. Within the first generations in America, the Lamanites' degeneracy was so profound that God intervened and cursed them with dark skin. God hoped that this demarcation would prevent confusion and perhaps mating between the righteous and white Nephites and the black-skinned Lamanites. Whiteness here signifies purity. Darkness signifies impiety and unworthiness. This perspective influenced the way early Mormons viewed dark-skinned people. Take, for example, the May 1844 patriarchal blessing Jane Manning James received from Hiram Smith. In this patriarchal blessing, James is marked as a descendant of the cursed lineages of Canaan, son of Ham. She is not of the royal lineages of Ephraim, Manasseh, or Jacob, designated as the progenitors of most early Latter-day Saints. Hiram tells Jane that this curse, this, quote, mark upon your forehead, unquote, that God himself placed, God, though, can remove and stamp upon you his own lineage, if, that is, she and her kin remain faithful to the gospel. Now, a 2012 reading of the Book of Mormon's position that whiteness is close to godliness is disturbing. But the Book of Mormon is not solely a text of white or neo-Israelite supremacy. It also teaches of the possible redemption of all humanity, even those accursed with dark skin. Jane Manning James can work to have the mark of Canaan removed from her forehead. The patriarchal blessing of Elijah Abel, the most well-known black priesthood holder ordained during Joseph Smith's lifetime, foretells in the kingdom to come that he will be, quote, equal to thy brethren, and thy soul be white in eternity, unquote. In an age when Harvard's Louis Agassiz and other professors of polygenism gave the rigidity of racial categories the imprimatur of science, Mormons professed the more modern view that race was mutable and constructed. Blackness signified unworthiness, but blackness wasn't always fixed to black bodies. In 1838, as Willard Richards described a trustworthy freed slave he was sending north from Richmond to his brother in Boston, quote, black skin may cover as white a heart as any other skin, and the black hand may be as neat and clean as the white one, unquote. Now, the converse also held true. In March 1845, John Taylor's Nauvoo neighbor declared the murderers of Joseph and Hiram, who blackened their faces before the assault on the Carthage jail, quote, no doubt are sorry that they have white skin. The black masks that made their faces correspond with their, quote, black hearts, unquote. Black men and women can become white and worthy through their dedication to the gospel. White men become black for their perfidy and anti-Mormon violence. Now, certainly today, the Book of Mormon's conceptions of whiteness as the mark of worthiness makes us squirm in our seats. Yet for the Book of Mormon's earliest believers, whiteness was both a real racial category and a signifier of worthiness that can be applied to all who prove themselves worthy and dedicated to the Mormon gospel. Aspect 2, Joseph Smith, a slavery apologist and an abolitionist presidential candidate. In an April 1836 article published in the Messenger and Advocate, Joseph Smith presented a defense of American chattel slavery that could have been written by any antebellum pro-slavery apologist. Smith excoriated Northern abolitionists as instigators of discord among Southern slaves. If slaves and slave masters lived by the code of paternalistic mutual obligation, apologists cited Ephesians 6 for this paternalistic code, often slaves obeying their masters, the masters caring for their slaves. Both bondsman and master would fulfill their biblically mandated duties, creating societies of Christian unity, prosperity, and peace. 8 years later, as Professor Bushman has already spoken about, Joseph Smith, the one-time pro-slavery apologist, became the gradual abolitionist candidate for the presidency of the United States. Frustrated that leading politicians refused to protect Mormons' constitutionally mandated civil rights, Smith decided to run for president himself. Smith opens his presidential platform by declaring that the ongoing Mormon persecutions have shown that when it comes to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, namely that government shall protect the God-given rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Mormons need not apply. Hundreds of our kindred have been incarcerated, Smith declared, unjustly detained for practicing their faith. But Joseph's persecuted religious minority was actually second on his list of Americans whom the government had most egregiously failed. The men and women most in need of reparation were some 2 or 3 millions of people who are held as slaves because of the color of their skin. Now, slaves and Mormons here made kin in General Smith's presidential platform by unlawful bondage and unconstitutional persecution. Third aspect, Utah slavery and Utah freedom. In February 1852, Utah's first territorial legislature made slavery legal. From the outside, the legalization of slavery in Utah meant that the twin relics of barbarism, as the 1856 Republican presidential platform called slavery and polygamy, were both now in practice in Zion. The introduction of slavery was also noticed and derided by the most famous black man in America, Frederick Douglass. In the North Star and in the Frederick Douglass papers, Douglass had before printed empathetic reports of the Mormons' expulsion from Illinois, in which he implied kinship with this religious sect, who, like African Americans, were often deemed enemies to the white American Republic, and as such were frequent victims of Judge Lynch's vigilante violence. Only when Brigham Young moved to legalize slavery in Utah did Douglass's paper make mention of polygamy for the first time, equating it, as did many anti-polygamists, with the institution of chattel slavery itself. Yet what the Republicans and Douglass both failed to realize is that Utah slavery was not the same as the peculiar institution practiced in the South. Certainly, Young's decision had a lot to do with placing Mormon slave masters on the right side of law. However, more than the so-called Negro problem, It was the Indian problem that led to the legalization of slavery in Utah. By regulating slavery, LDS leaders hoped to curb the lucrative trade of Indian slaves along the old Spanish Trail that passed through the territory. Motivated by Mormons' unique theological views and compassion for Indian slaves, who were mostly women and children captured from weaker tribes, Mormons hoped to buy enslaved Indians into freedom, place them in Mormon homes, the children, or marry them to Mormon men, transforming these savages, and this is the language they used, into civilized Lamanites, one step closer to making them white and delightsome. Young and his legislature intended to differentiate Utah's system of slavery in two fundamental ways. First, under the threat of prison, a hefty fine, and the forfeiture of ownership, Utah outlawed, quote, carnal intercourse with African slaves. Sleeping with your slaves was both a storied pastime for Southern masters and a means of increasing your wealth. Secondly, the legislature made it a duty of all masters to educate their slaves, to send them to school for no less than 18 months. And this was in the legislative laws. This compulsory education in Utah stood in sharp contrast with the Southern practice of compulsory ignorance, in which most states in the antebellum South criminalized slave education out of fear that reading and writing slaves might lead to slaves in revolt. Young was no Joseph Smith. During the same legislative session, he made his position on the inherent distinction between worthy whites and accursed blacks unequivocal in this often, perhaps too often repeated phrase, any man, as he said, any man having one drop of seed of Cain in him cannot hold the priesthood, as he said. Yet Young also made it clear that he personally deplored slavery. My own feelings are that no property can or should be recognized as existing in slaves, whether Indian or African, unquote. If slavery had to come to Utah, and Young believed it did, ironically as a means of liberating Indians, it would not be the slavery practiced by the so-called Christian Southern slave masters. It would be a more benign, even Mormon, form of the institution. Fourth and last point, jumping ahead about 100 years to the Civil Rights era, a denial and a rediscovery of a black Mormon past. During the Civil Rights era, the LDS Church's leadership was famous for its recalcitrance towards changing views of race in America. Until his death in 1973, church historian turned church president Joseph Fielding Smith, who was the most famous articulator of the pre-existence thesis of black accursedness, publicly defended the immutability of the priesthood restriction. Time and again, he insisted the practice was consistent with the teachings of Joseph Smith and established by the Lord. There had never been black priesthood holders, and thus there had never been a black Mormon past. During the 1950s and 60s, many brethren declared that not only were blacks ineligible for the priesthood, that the danger that their, quote, cursed blood might soil pure lineages meant that the church discouraged interracial marriage, and until 1963, many church leaders supported racial segregation. Now, not all leading Mormons agreed with the Brethren stance. Mitt Romney today proudly boasts of his father's pro-slavery, pro-civil rights stance. That would be a significant problem. The Democratic U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, proposed an alternative Mormon position when it came to African Americans in America. In a much publicized 1967 letter addressed to the church's first presidency, Udall declared that, quote, the restriction now imposed on Negro fellowship is a social and institutional practice having no real sanction in essential Mormon thought. It is clearly contradictory to our most cherished spiritual and moral ideals, unquote. Now, the brethren did not like getting lectured to and told Udall directly. But in some ways, they listened to the growing chorus outside the hierarchy, and some actually, certainly within it, who found the perpetuation of the priesthood ban untenable. A 1969 statement from the church's first presidency reduced the ban to a mystery of faith and urged Mormons to patiently await the Lord to overturn it. Yet the first presidency also narrated a past of persecution shared by both blacks and Mormons. Quote, "We know something of the sufferings of those who are discriminated against in a denial of their civil and constitutional privileges. We believe that the Negro should have full constitutional privileges as a member of society," unquote. This is the same year that the LDS Church was, or Brigham Young University had become kind of notorious for being the target of protests against their football team. So let me end this brief discussion of the civil rights era by pointing to another pressure point applied to the priesthood ban. Historians, yes, historians, mostly Mormons themselves, but also with important interventions by the likes of our own Jan Ships, whose first article actually addressed the priesthood ban in a time before, proved that the ban was a historical accretion, not based on any specific revelation or sacred scripture. Lester Bush's exhaustive 10-year study of church records found no evidence that Joseph Smith himself started the ban, the main argument the church hierarchy had used to justify it for over a century. Over the particularistic doctrine that limited the full rights of the gospel to a select set of ancient lineages, these historians found that the early church emphasized Mormon universalism, a universalism that rejected the puritanical idea that the sons, even the purported sons of Cain and Canaan, to be held responsible for the sins of their fathers. And I think this is one of the most fundamental aspects of Mormon theology, is the rejection of the sins of the fathers falling onto the sons. Now, to conclude, a few questions. I'd like to end the telling of the history of Black-Mormon relations as a twice-told tale by posing 3 questions about how these histories might figure into today's discussions. First, does Romney have to say more about Mormonism and race, either out of political expediency or out of some moral or theological obligation? This will continue to come up, the LDS's relationship with its black membership if Romney gets the nomination. Even today, there are new articles being published. In his New York Times article, Lee Siegel asked, perhaps poorly, as Joanna Brooks so eloquently pointed out, if this is both. I think the implicit message of his article is this both a Mormon and a black moment in American presidential politics? In other words, as the national electorate debates whether or not it is comfortable with a Mormon as president, has the election of Barack Obama really proven that America is comfortable with a black president? Finally, let me pose a counterintuitive question on Romney's pursuit of the Republican nomination. The oft-told history of Mormon racial exclusion suggests that Romney has, in fact, a black problem. Yet Gingrich, his chief rival to the nomination, continues to engage in what some pundits have called dog whistle racial politics, namely calling Obama the food stamp president, for example. In this environment, at least I'm talking about the Republican nominating process, in this environment, can Romney make his increasingly racially universalistic Mormon faith a political asset if he directly addresses this? In other words, does the Mormon Mitt Romney really have to have a black problem? Thank you.
Do we have time for questions? I'm wondering if Aubrey's here, actually. I haven't seen him, but please. Yeah. Please, if you would.
First of all, I'd like to thank you all very much for this very, very valuable and educational conference. And just a quick self-ID before I ask my very quick question, if I may. I wrote it so I can be
Please go ahead.
I'm former U.S. Department of State Foreign Service in Turkey, Oman, Sweden, U.S. mission to the UN under Richard Holbrooke. I'm a Republican in Harlem. You can see my scars. And I'm supporting Mitt Romney. I was born in Louisiana as a Catholic, raised a Catholic, and though now I'm a bit wayward in issues. I respect all religions. If you worship a caterpillar with orange stripes, I'd say fine, just don't impose it on me. In Harlem, there is an LDS, I don't know whether to call it a church or an office.
Anything else?
And last, I respect the Mormon Church for its power and missionary work, and first on the scene for international disasters, and would welcome their qualities of patriotism, etc., on behalf of my country. Now, my big question, if it's proper to ask here, why does one convert to LDS? Anyone have a comment, Ms. Ships?
I think you're asking the wrong people.
Well, my own general answer is the appeal of the family and the way in which the family figures in the Mormon story, and its appeal to both people who are and have families that are precious to them and people who do not but hope to. And this is, so I see that not as the only, but I see that as a big part of the appeal of Mormonism.
And wouldn't you say in the 19th century, too, a big part of the appeal was the fact that the scriptures located divine activity here in America, right? Here in the Americas, right?
I think that's very important. I think it was probably more important in the 19th century than it is today. But today, I think that the appeal shifts and changes across time, of course, as we know.
Please.
So I'm not sure how many people know this here, but it's always interesting to note that in this election season there's a third Mormon presidential candidate. The only catch is that he's not in the United States. A man named Yea Samake is running for, a black man is running for the presidency of the country of Mali, 90% Muslim country in Saharan, sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I wanted to ask, it's really interesting to consider this case from tons of different standpoints, and I wanted to ask Mr. Mueller whether he would see this candidacy being noticed. I haven't heard any coverage outside of Utah newspapers, and if Yea Samake were elected president of Mali, what sort of effect would that have on perceptions of Mormon-black relations, especially when oftentimes, as you have noted, they are caricatured?
Yeah, actually, I've met. I attended a rally or a fundraiser in the Valley, in the Utah Valley for the mayor. He's a mayor in Mali, and he's running on his record as a mayor in Mali of really changing. The biggest thing he helped to do was increase this tax revenue in his community. Not unlike Italy or Greece, in Mali they were having a hard time getting folks to pay up their taxes. So we went from 10% rate of tax increase to 68 to 70%, which is an important source of revenue for governmental support of the people. Yeah, he's certainly a fascinating man. I think I wonder about his political viability actually in Mali. He claims to be a front runner, but a lot of people claim to be a front. Joseph Smith might have at one time claimed to be a front runner in 1844. But let me speak to the African aspect of African Mormon relations. The biggest growth area in Black Mormonism is certainly in Africa. And I'm on a lot of Black Mormon blogs, or I follow them quite regularly, and a lot of Black or African converts. This is a huge growth area, partly because African Americans, frankly, have a preconceived notion of, they know what the LDS Church is about. When African Americans convert to Mormonism, in some ways they get it from frankly, from both sides. I mean, in some ways, often their African-American communities ostracize them, and they don't necessarily feel, not always, but they don't necessarily feel that comfortable as black Mormons. In fact, I would say that the gathering occurs, African-American members move to Utah if a gathering still exists in Mormonism. But that would be a huge coup to have an African presidential, a president in Africa. I can imagine temples. I can imagine a safe zone in a very contentious space in Africa from which the LDS Church could spread its message and talk about a great PR coup also.
Other questions?
I have I have a live question. My first question was a sincere question. What do we think? Does Romney have a responsibility to say anything? I mean, I think that's a live question.
Does somebody want to take that up before we move on to the next question? Go ahead, please.
I'm in touch with the campaign. As a matter of fact, they know about this conference. I would say that he doesn't have to lean too heavily on it. I think we right now need to deal with the situation of the middle class and jobs and so forth. And I think that if he's attacked, I think we should remind them of the mistakes of the Catholic Church, etc. So to say that nobody stands there clean, that's what I would say.
Okay.
I just wanted to make a quick comment and ask a question as well. Just on the question of conversion, I think that just as a Mormon, I think most Mormons would probably say conversion is because of kind of based in our epistemology, in the sense that, you know, having had a very profound experience with the Holy Spirit that, for me at least, was unlike nothing else I've ever experienced in this lifetime, brought a very deep conviction for me of the truth of the gospel that's, helped me to feel closest in connection with God. To me, that's more in terms of appeal, I think family and all, but in terms of conversion, that's my personal experience. But I just wanted to ask Jen Shipps, you said about, you talked about Benson and Huey Brown, and I believe Huey Brown was a Canadian and a Democrat, I think. And I was wondering if you knew anything more about how that interaction took place, where you said he sort of asked him, was the influence to bring him back from pushing that perspective on the church as a whole?
I think the best source for that information is Greg Prince's biography of David O. McKay, because there are lots of references in there to David O. McKay and Ezra Taft Benson, the story of his being saved from being on the John Birch magazine is in there as well. I think that's the best. And so I would go there first. And I will tell you that to try to read, there's not a good biography that I can find of Ezra Taft Benson. There are several books on Ezra Taft Benson, but they don't tell his entire story in any way, the way the biography of David O. McKay does tell the story. The Huey Brown book, his references in his book to Ezra Taft Benson are all just, he is a wonderful Latter-day Saint. They're all he's a friend and so forth. But in the 60s, when we were in Utah, there was a lot of conversation among non-Mormons. I don't mean non-Mormons. I mean what we were taught as Jack Mormons then, people who were Mormons, who had never asked to have their names removed, considered themselves Mormon, but they just weren't active. And the cocktail party conversation was often about what was going on inside the 12. So that's the way I was just fascinated by Greg Prince's, not only his book, but he has shared with me the diaries, and it's very interesting.
I don't want to eliminate the religious angle of this, but, and I'm certainly aware that Ezra Taft Benson's conservative politics did have a very great influence on the Mormon folk, especially in the western states. But I'm wondering if anyone has ever studied the increasing conservatism of Utah in the context of the larger region. My understanding is that Utah's neighbor states have also become much more Republican and much more conservative. Idaho, Wyoming, Nevada, Arizona, and that the non-Mormon Westerners have, as a whole, become much more conservative and much more Republican. And I'm wondering if it's possible, do you think, to factor out how much of this rightward shift is it due to the peculiarly Mormon influence of Ezra Taft Benson and larger political forces that are moving non-Mormon Westerners in that very same direction?
I'm not quite sure that you can really factor out the Mormon vote in the other states in the Mormon culture region, but in a wonderful essay written by Kathleen Flake, she does a very interesting parallel between, a very interesting story between Idaho and Utah, and she divides the southern part of Idaho, which is very Mormon, and the northern part of Idaho, and makes it clear that both are going through the same economic problems, the same issues that are facing people in the West. And especially water is a big, big problem for people in the West. So I'm not quite sure that if you got a water problem, you'd become a radical conservative, but it might be one of the issues that is extremely important.
Well, one commonality that all Westerners, Mormon and non-Mormon, have is the federal government is the landlord. Everyone hates the landlord.
That's true too.
I personally think that's it.
But they didn't hate the landlord in the New Deal. They didn't hate the landlord in the New Deal. The landlord was very, very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, the other factor that kind of goes along with that question is James Watt and the Sagebrush Rebellion. And of course, Watt became Secretary of the Interior under Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Rachel Morrissey. I just wanted to comment on what you were asking about whether or not Romney needed to make a statement. I grew up a Mormon Democrat in southern Idaho. And to be honest, it makes me nervous to think that Romney would make a statement and, oh, shoot, I'm so warm, I'm going to cry. But it makes me nervous to think that if Romney does make a statement asserting that this is a Mormon way to approach politics, or if the Mormons get even more associated with republicanism than they already are, that it will be a difficult thing for us to assert our that's a Mormon thing to do too. It will be difficult for us to assert that there is this legitimate Mormon liberal side that remembers or was brought up by people who very much participated in the New Deal programs that Ms. Schiff's talked about. Yeah. And so I'm not sure that I would be really, cheering for him to make any more statements than he already has about his religious beliefs and how they would affect a potential presidency.
It strikes me there's an interesting parallel between that situation and those who would consider themselves to be politically liberal evangelicals.
Yeah, it's the same.
Hi. This is no shock, but there are gay Mormons. I guess I could say I'm privileged to know about that since I taught a National Endowment for the Humanities seminar both in Salt Lake City and Provo some years ago, and because I was there for an entire summer, and because I could read Hebrew, which was fascinating to those who discovered it, I was embraced by lots of Mormon families outside of my professional responsibilities, and was invited several times to meetings, covert meetings, of lesbians and of gay males, and sometimes co-ed, so to speak. So it is no shock to me, and probably shouldn't be to anyone else, but this is a political question. The church or its, shall we say, advocates were involved a few years ago in California in supporting the public initiative with regard to gay marriage. Is there a dimension of this which is analogous, especially in terms of welcoming or not welcoming capacities between blacks and Mormons? And in a historical sense, is there another part of this story that we need to know more about with regard to the attitude towards homosexuality from the Mormon perspective?
Part of that story will be revealed, I think, this afternoon in one of the sessions, but it's a fair question, and if either of the panelists wants to take it on.
Yeah, theologically, I think the step, just speaking theologically, to include African Americans into the dispensation, into the full dispensation, is not as much of a leap, theologically speaking, because of the essential nature of the Mormon family and the heterosexual Mormon family as part of the soteriology, the idea of the eternity of the husband and wife connected together. So I don't know how much of a parallel, direct parallel that can be made. I just want to say, though, just like there are Democratic, as you pointed out, there are gay Mormons. Just like there are Democratic Mormons, there are folks in the church that are actively participating with the brethren to have a more open discussion about these issues, and a lot of Latter-day Saints were disheartened, as we will find out later, by some of the activities, direct political activities.
Thank you.
My name is Anthony Moustakas. I was going to comment on, I'm going to comment on the political side, but in regards to the person before me regarding the gay factor. I was born and raised here in New York City, and my parents are Greek immigrants, so I'm a Greek New Yorker. I became a member of the church through an acting school that I was part of, and it was owned by two gay Mormons. And it was these two gay Mormons that introduced me to the church, that brought me into the church. I just wanted to mention that. But I'm not gay, okay. Now, as far as your comments on the Mormons and blacks, I follow the politics very closely, a little bit of a political animal. And the black issue has been really on my mind much regarding Romney and the Republicans. We all know that 90% are going to vote Democrat anyway, so it doesn't even really matter. But it can be an issue that they can play on. My biggest concern has been the evangelical issue. It's becoming less and less of an issue with time, but you have the core evangelicals, some of them in leadership positions that are, vehemently anti-Mormon. They make no bones about it. And I think South Carolina was one of the reasons why, and some of the southern states on the Super Tuesday coming up in March may give Gingrich some traction. But the evangelical issue, I think, is going to be a bigger issue than the black issue. And
Well, you're speaking of the argument that Mormonism is not Christian, is the evangelical position. And the evangelical position is, it seems to me, easier to answer by saying that Mormonism is not Christian the way Protestants and Catholics are Christian. And you can make that case And then all you have to say is there a Supreme Court on the earth that decides who is Christian and who is not? But that may be a little much for the world out there. But it seems to me that Romney learned a lot in 2008 to stop using evangelical language to describe his Mormonism. It just was.
Well, his new tactic is don't discuss religion, period.
I know it is. Yeah, I know it is.
Richard Land, though, on the night of the South Carolina, but right before we knew the results were going to go towards Gingrich, but Richard Land on NPR actually directly addressed this issue. Richard Land is certainly one of the most prominent evangelical leaders in the country as part of the Southern Baptist Convention. And he said Mormonism isn't Mitt Romney's problem. In fact, if he were more, this is Richard Land speaking, if he were more Mormon, if he were more in line with his church, and now we can debate whether or not this is correct, on issues of same-sex marriage, on issues of abortion, then his conservative bona fides would never be in question. So, and you know, that's Richard Land speaking in South Carolina. Richard Land also last year said that Mormonism is not Christian. So, you know, he's willing, I think, to make a political alliance with Mormonism, conservative political alliance, not unlike the Catholic, even Protestant alliance.
Yeah, I think Richard Land is evangelicalism's Ezra Taft Benson.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me, having grown up in the South, that if Romney is the candidate, the evangelicals and the Protestants in the South will hold their nose and vote for him because they prefer a Mormon who is a funny kind of Christian than a black person.
Okay.
Then they hate Barack Obama so much that.
Core evangelicals hate the Mormons.
Well, that's what we'll find out.
That's what we'll find out.
It's 12 o'clock exactly. We'll conclude with our thanks to this panel and reconvene at 1 o'clock.